As we talk about public communication, it's crucial to talk about using evidence. This is something you're going to need to know how to do effectively and ethically for every paper and presentation that you produce. So we'll talk about what is evidence, particularly what makes for strong evidence, using evidence ethically, and what are fallacies within some of our evidence, things we want to avoid. So as you get your brain turning, some questions for you. My understanding is that most folks know these terms, but especially when we talk about evidence and how to support your argument, you definitely want to review them. So you should be able to say what is ethos, what is logos, and what is pathos. So these are all appeals to persuasion, but they're different types of appeals. And so for each of these appeals listed above, explain an example of it in use that you've actually seen in real life. So looking at advertisements or speeches is a really easy place to find these if you need a little bit of direction. So ethos, logos, pathos, what are they? What does it mean that they're appeals to persuasion? What's an example of them? Questions that you always need to start as you develop a presentation is what is the exigency? So what is the need of the situation? What is the goal of your presentation or your paper? Who's the audience for it? What delivery style are you using? What is your topic? Researching your topic and writing your speech. And so you need to be aware of all of these steps as you decide what evidence is going to best work in this situation. Not just what supports my topic, but for this particular audience, in this moment, what type of evidence is ethical and is effective? So there's different types of evidence. Testimony is whenever you go get a quote or information from somebody, basically. We've got two different types. We have peer testimony and we have expert testimony. Expert testimony are all of those people with all the credentials and letters after their name, and they are an expert in the field, right? So if you are talking about difficulties in birth, an obstetrician, Dr. Sam, may be useful, but just any kind of doctor, not going to work, right? So you need to be aware of what they're an expert in and not just that they have a PhD or that they have the title doctor or right, whatever it might be. So actually check what are the credentials, and you need to tell your audience what those credentials are in order for that credibility to work, right, for the audience. And then peer testimony, these are everyday people, right? And so for instance, if you're giving a speech about life in the dorms, maybe you have expert testimony about how effective it is on student success rates in the first year if they have a positive dorm experience, but then you also maybe have peer testimony about, let me tell you some stories about life in the dorm. Like here's people's comments about what it's actually like to live in a dorm with a roommate, without a roommate, whatever, right? So you can actually use peer testimony to help bring things to life, right, for an everyday person. Narrative is expanding on that idea. A narrative is an actual story, right? You're telling far more of somebody's story to help present an idea, to help support an idea, right? So it's not just like a passing quote here and there. This is actually kind of going into depth into someone's story. And maybe it's your own story, right? That could be part of it. Demonstration is what it sounds like. You're demonstrating how to do something. One of the classics is like putting a condom on a banana. At this point, not an effective visual aid or an effective speech topic because it's overdone, but that's an example of a demonstration. Right? Participation, this is where you get the audience to actually help create the information with you. So for instance, taste tests, right? If you're giving them taste tests and through that taste test they are proving for themselves that A is better than B, that's evidence, right? And they've created that evidence through participation. Using evidence, no matter what type it is, falls under some very particular standards. So first of all, you need to decide, this is my argument, this is the point of my speech, so how do I support that? And you need to present evidence that is going to be effective for a particular audience. So logos, what's the logic involved here? What are the stats? What's the rational thinking? Pathos, how can I evoke feeling in my audience? And ethos, what's the credibility of my sources? What's the credibility of myself? How do I get that across to the audience? And ideally, for an effective presentation, you want to balance these. You want all three of these types of appeals, but for some audiences, maybe you want more pathos than you do logos. For some, maybe you really need to push on that ethos piece, right? It's going to really depend on the situation, on the audience, on what you're trying to achieve. But in general, you do want all three types, and you want to balance them in some way. And so who your audience is a really crucial question here. However, no matter who your audience is, evidence must always be credible, be relevant, be sufficient, and be representative. So it needs to be credible evidence in the sense that, yeah, this is legit, and I'm going to tell you where this came from and why this is a legitimate source, why this is an authority, and that's why we use oral citations, right? So we give credit where credit is due, but we're also telling the audience, here's why this evidence is worth listening to. Relevant is, this is evidence that's actually related to what I'm talking about, right? I'm not just like throwing in random information that sounds good, right? This is actually part of the situation or related to the situation. Sufficient, you're actually giving enough evidence. It's not just like one or two quick pieces, but you've actually developed a good argument and you've given enough for the audience to say, yeah, with, I see X, Y, Z you've told me about here, and this is all making sense now. So is there enough information there? And then this last one, is it representative? So is this sample doing what you say it is, right? So the numbers that you're using, the example that you're using, is it actually demonstrating across the population that you're talking about, it actually affects, right? So for instance, a really classic example of this would be heart attack, right? So we hear a lot about heart attack symptoms are pain in the chest, left side going numb. However, what we have found in recent years is that those are symptoms for white men. Symptoms for women are significantly different. For instance, pain in the lower back, right? And not chest pain. And so that it caused a problem that a lot of people outside of that white male category weren't able to accurately identify heart attack symptoms because the sample that had always been used as evidence for when you feel these things you need to call, right? That's a persuasive message. But the evidence that was given, the statistics that were given, wasn't thorough enough. And so people who needed the information didn't receive the right information. For a lot of evidence, it is useful to bring in a visual aid, right? If you're telling a story, maybe not so much. But I'm about to give you some examples of, especially when we throw numbers around, visuals can be very helpful, and you want to be able to kind of point things out on the screen, stuff like that. So, there are very particular ways to use visual aids. We won't go into them here, but do consider, does all of my evidence need to be on a visual aid? Does some of it so that I can go in more depth about pieces of it? And so use visual aids strategically. Right? So the next few slides, I'm going to demonstrate some not so great uses of evidence, and we'll talk about why that is. So this is a little bit of humor about how polling stations and news stations tend to sometimes use stats and poll numbers, but use them incorrectly and use them unethically to convey a situation that doesn't actually exist. So, dear news media, when reporting poll results, please keep in mind the following suggestions. Number 1, if two poll numbers differ by less than the margin of error, it's not actually a news story. Number 2, scientific facts are not determined by public opinion polls. Right? And this is something that we see a lot, for instance, in the vaccination debate of who gets to speak about who should be vaccinated or not, and what we find is that lay people, so non-experts, non-scientists, are making scientific arguments, supposedly, that are not actually backed by science, and they are not actually experts and credible in those things. Right? So we see it a lot with medical-related topics such as vaccinations. Number 3, a poll taken of your viewers and internet users is not actually a scientific poll. Right? So it's biased. It's, you're pulling information that it's your users. Of course, that's going to be a biased population. And number 4, what if all polls included the option, I don't care, right? And so if you're leaving out that large category, you're not representing numbers ethically. You're not representing what they actually are. So I think you've all heard that phrase. It's a Mark Twain quote that says, "There are lies, damn lies, and then statistics." Right? The argument being is that depending how you use numbers, you can demonstrate anything you want with them based on what numbers you use, what numbers you leave out, and how you put those numbers together. So we'll see that example in just a moment. So here I have 2 sets of very real numbers. One is a piece of information from the Organic Trade Association of 2011. It was from an organic industry survey, and that is the rate of organic food sales. And so we see that with the pink squares on the chart. And so here we have an X and a Y axis. So we have the years, and we have sales in millions. Okay? And then the other piece of information comes from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs. And so this is children with disabilities receiving special education. And so autism rates are marked with the purple triangle. So again, we have the same years, and here we have the number of individuals diagnosed, right? And so if we look at these 2 numbers, organic food sales and autism, they rise at approximately the same rate across the same number of years. However, just because these 2 numbers are correlated, they do indeed rise at approximately the same rate in approximately the same amount of time, does not mean that the increase of organic food sales led to an increase in autism rates. Right? So it's this really important idea here that says correlation is not causation. Just because 2 numbers are correlated together, look like they're changing together, does not mean that one caused the other. But if someone were to use this chart, that argument might be made. It would be wrong, but people do not always use evidence ethically. For instance, September 29th, 2015, at a congressional hearing about funding or defunding Planned Parenthood, State Senator Jason Shaftez from Utah, so he actually used this chart in his presentation. The source of this chart was Americans United for Life, which is a topic organization, right? They're not a neutral source. They're a very biased source. And so here we have an article that I've given you the link to. So the link here is from PolitiFact, and you can go to this website and see the whole article. But it's published on October 1st, and this chart has been declared misleading and ethically wrong. So let's look at why that is. Right? So first of all, we only have one axis. We only have the years, so we don't have those other comparison rates, which when we look at this, okay, so let's say, so we have no numbers on the side here. So abortions, 289,750 in 2006. That's a real number. Okay, so that's the number of abortions that Planned Parenthood conducted. In 2013, apparently they conducted 327,000, right? So the number of abortions that have been conducted at Planned Parenthood have increased by about 50,000 in those years, from 2006 to 2013. And then we go to cancer screenings and prevention services, and we have this huge, big, scary downward arrow in line. And cancer screenings and prevention services is actually a very important role of Planned Parenthood. That's why it receives so much funding. And they're arguing that 2 million cancer screenings occurred in 2006, and then that has dropped to 935,000 in 2013. Reasons for this, right, aren't listed here. There are lots that could be. The important thing that we want to look at is how this information is presented as so startlingly different. And we want to look. So remember that we don't have the side axis, right? And so here we have 2 million. Here we have 289,000. And then all of a sudden over here, we have 327,000 is somehow significantly higher in the chart than 935,000. Right, this is 1/3 the amount of that. So the way that this information is presented is misleading, is poorly done, right? If anyone who's taken a math or statistics class, this is just terrible, right? I'm sure math teachers around the country were clutching their hearts. And that's not to say the numbers are wrong, it's how the information is presented that is wrong. Right? So the statement that was used in conjunction with this chart by Senator Jason Chaftez was, in 2006, Planned Parenthood performed more prevention services and cancer screenings than abortions, but in 2013 there were more abortions. When really, in 2013, there were 327,000 abortions, and there were 935,000 cancer screenings. So he looked at the position of the arrows, he did not look at the numbers, right? Which is why this is a misleading and unethical chart. I do recommend you read the entire article. It has a good explanation of how this evidence is so poorly presented. And the reason that I bring this evidence in is because this was all over the news when it happened, so it's a hot topic of conversation, and it's rare that a conversation like this happens in the mainstream media very often, and so that's why it's worth mentioning and worth taking a minute to look at, because these were numbers used in a congressional hearing that was nationally televised, that affects millions and millions of dollars of funding in the nation. So this is why evidence matters. So it's important when we're doing evidence to avoid what we call fallacies. Fallacies, right? False. And fallacies, what they are is these are ways that evidence can be used that misrepresent the evidence, that misrepresent what is going to happen. So if something is called a slippery slope, it means if X happens, obviously we're going to end all the way down here. A real argument that was used against gay marriage that said if we're going to let people of the same sex marriage that marry, then that's going to lead to people are going to marry animals, because obviously that's where this is going to go, right? That same-sex couples marrying is so against the Bible and nature that the next step is obviously going to be people wanting to marry animals. So that is very much a slippery slope argument, because it's going to this place that is way too far down the line to actually be an accurate comparison. A straw person argument is you set up an argument that is incredibly weak or has already been proven wrong, and you set it up just to knock it down and make yourself look better, right? But really it's called a straw person argument because it's so fluff, right? There's nothing, it's not standing on anything anymore, often because it's already been proven wrong, right? But not everybody knows that necessarily, right? So some people will take advantage of audience members' lack of knowledge to misrepresent information. Ad hominem means against a person, so hominid, hominem, against a person, right? So if one of the arguments when the Affordable Care Act was trying to be implemented, which we also call Obamacare, was the Affordable Care Act is never going to work because Obama is a communist. So there what is happening is someone is not arguing against the act or pieces of the act. They are arguing against the person, Obama, associated with the act, right? And so you're not actually matching arguments. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc, means if this, then therefore this. Right? That's the literal translation that says if this happened, X, if Y happened, therefore obviously Y will happen, right? And so it's often just using kind of one example and saying, well, now obviously that's always going to be the case, right? Bandwagon appeal is if everybody's going to do it, wouldn't you too? Hasty generalization is painting really broad strokes and generalizing things way too much to actually be an accurate comparison. Either or presents a really black or white argument with no options in between, which is usually not the case, right? Either we stop fracking or we have nuclear holocaust in winter, right? And there's nothing in between those things, which is not true. A red herring this is when you're bringing in evidence that is not relevant. So if you read mysteries or you know anything about writing mysteries, then when something's called a red herring, it basically means that someone has thrown in a clue that is meant to throw you off. It's meant to take you in the wrong direction. And then the halo effect, right? So imagine kind of a halo, an aura is, if someone's associated with it, then you stop investigating the evidence because it's attached to something good, and so obviously this then too must be good. These are really very quick explanations of what can be some very complex ideas, and there are far, far more fallacies than I've listed here. These are just some of the quickest and most common that we see, but I've also given you a link here, and there are tons of places all over the internet that you can find more explanation of fallacies. I've given you one because it gives an explanation of what is a fallacy, where did this idea come from, but also breaks down a long list of fallacies and what they mean. So if you're interested in more information, I definitely recommend looking up some more if you don't know them, because these are things that you very much have to avoid within your own use of evidence in order to be an ethical speaker or an ethical writer. So the takeaway here is that the credibility of evidence doesn't vary by audience, right? Credible evidence is credible evidence. It's legitimate, it's backed by experts, right? Whatever it might be. Credible evidence doesn't change. The effectiveness of evidence can change by audience, which is why it's so crucial that you learn not only how to ethically use evidence, but you also learn how to effectively use it based on context, based on audience, based on your goal. Right? And so remember that you need to research your audience and adjust accordingly. You need to balance the different types of evidence that you're using. I strongly recommend for strong, effective speeches that you have some flexibility in the evidence, right? So for instance, you're now this very strong extemporaneous speaker and you have a lot of knowledge about the topic. You've also kind of included in your notes some extra stuff that says, all right, my audience is looking really confused right now. I'm going to pause and I'm going to offer some more evidence. I'm going to expand on this idea a little bit more. Oh, but now I'm running a little bit of short of time, or they're looking bored. I'm pretty sure they've got this idea. How am I going to cut this out a bit while still kind of making my argument? So knowing what evidence is really crucial, knowing what evidence might be of assistance but is not crucial, right, will really help you decide what to include, what not to include, what can help those time constraints or help clarify for your audience. And then really, really big takeaway here, people, is ethics. Right? How you use evidence is crucial to the message.